Okay, so the hard problem of psychedelic consciousness, hallucinations and or revelations. Just out of interest, who's heard of the so-called hard problem of consciousness? Who's looked into it? Okay, small minority. Okay, so let's begin. So the plan is this. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give another psychedelic, a scheme of psychedelic experiences. How do we understand, how can we categorize psychedelic experiences? Some people say they're ineffable, you know, William James famously, but then he went on to talk about them in many, many words thereafter. After that, I'll be talking about interpretative options, veridicality, falsiticality, not a nice word I understand, meriocality. I'll explain those terms in a moment, and I apologize for any big words, but in philosophy the reason for big words is to avoid big sentences. So it's actually, it all really makes sense. Thirdly, we'll come to the crux of the matter really, which is physicalism and the mind, the hard problem of consciousness. So I'll explain what the hard problem of consciousness is generally and how it applies to understanding psychedelic experience in the limited time I have. I mean, you could write, you know, many books about this. Fourthly, the criteria for determining veridicality. I'll explain that word in a minute, but veridicality means that the object of your experience is real. Then you think, well, why don't you just use the word real? Well, I'll tell you why in a moment. And then fifthly, we'll look at metaphysics for psychedelics. I should say as well that this talk is mostly negative in the sense that I'm going to be saying interpretations which can be ruled out for various reasons. Then at the end, in the fifth point, I'll be sort of promoting a positive look, but it's primarily negative, I'm afraid. Okay, so let's start with a schema, a framework for psychedelic experiences. So when I'm talking about whether they are hallucinations or revelations, what am I talking about? Well, very generally, and this is not the only schema, of course, you can have, I think, from my own experiences and through reading, you can generally categorize psychedelic experiences into three main types. That is of the other, so that could be aliens or whatever. Could also be God, you know, Rudolph's also God, the great other. Things other than yourself, and that's with eyes open, you know, the things you see, and eyes shut as well. Unity, secondly, is quite a common psychedelic experience, which is linked to the mystical or cosmic consciousness in the literature. I consider mystical consciousness to be a subcategory of psychedelic experience. So today there are many people who say, oh, well, you know, it's a Western legacy to sort of look at psychedelic experience in a mystical, theological way. But I think it's, you know, I think certain psychedelic experiences could be categorized as mystical, but not all of them, of course not. And then the self, and so today there's a lot of focus on therapeutic use of psychedelics, and that involves coming to understand yourself, your present self, your character, also your past self, and so on. And I won't focus on the self so much today, but I'll happily talk about it afterwards. And then with those three very generalized types of psychedelic experience, there are 10 modes here I've put down. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you know, the slides will go online. So, you know, with the other, for example, you can have perceptions of them, imagery, synesthesia, novel kinds of perception that we don't have in prosaic consciousness. You can conceptualize it. There are emotions about it, or just emotions per se, feelings about it. Interesting, I was reading the other day that the difference between emotions and feelings is a distinction that in China is not really there. So this could be, even this categorization could be a sort of legacy of Western ways of thinking. So like in certain tests, just read a journalistic article about it, but emotions in East Asia are very much linked to feelings, and in the West they're sort of distinct or more abstracted from them. Rationality, how rational are we under psychedelic experiences? That could be then for the other, the unity of the self. I think certain drugs allow for more rationality, like mescaline, and Mike J would know more about that probably, compared to other ones. Aesthetics, so you can perceive something, but then the next judgment, as it were, at least in logical analysis, is whether it's beautiful, sublime, so on. The level of consciousness, subconsciousness, access conscious means total focus to having sort of experiences that you can't really focus on, but are nonetheless there. Doxa, this is what I'll be focused on, the belief, level of belief. So do you believe that it's veridical, true, or do you believe it's completely false? Level, how high are you, heroic dose to microdose? And control, the level, the extent to which one is controlling one's mind or being controlled. And this is what William James called passivity, saying that in most mystical experiences, and he included drug experience therein, one is passive. But an interesting question as to the extent of this and whether it's necessary. Anyway, so with regard to all of those psychedelic experiences, and like I say, you can categorize them in different ways as well, this is the main question for a lot of people. Some people think it's completely unimportant, but I personally think it's important. Can psychedelic states reveal any objective reality, or are they always subjective? In other words, can psychedelic experiences be veridical? So the word veridical, why don't I just say real? If I were to ask, can psychedelic experiences be real, it would be confusing because you can mean two things by that. Like, in other words, well, the experience itself is real. A person is having the experience, so they sort of exist in that sense. Veridical means that the object of the experience is real. In other words, independent of one's own mind or one's own self. Another way of putting that question is, can psychedelic experiences provide revelations? Can they reveal truths? Or are they merely hallucinations? Are they products of the brain alone? William James, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. He was a great psychologist. 100 years ago, psychology and philosophy of mind were pretty much the same thing. They sort of diverged in the 20th century. But he talked about four aspects of a mystical experience, and noetic quality was one of them, by which he means this: drugs can provide states of insight into depths of truths unplumbed by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations, revelations. In other words, to many people, under the influence, there is a feeling that what one is seeing is true, is real. Now that may not last. Of course, when one returns to prosaic consciousness, normal consciousness, that feeling may have gone and one thinks, why did I think that? But nonetheless, it seems fair to say that this feeling accompanies many psychedelic states. The Nobel laureate Octavio Paz writes the same thing. The person, quote, the person who takes a psychedelic drug implicitly doubts the solidity of reality. He's not sure that it is what it appears to be and what our instruments define it as being, or he suspects that another reality exists. Octavio Paz, by the way, is a very, very interesting writer with regards to psychedelic drugs. He also goes into nihilism in relation to psychedelic drugs, which is another talk, very interesting one. Bertrand Russell as well. He wrote this great essay, and I recommend it if you haven't read it, written in 1914, called Mysticism and Logic. If you don't know Bertrand Russell, by the way, he was a great British philosopher. He was the student of Whitehead, who's sort of mathematician, logician, and philosopher. He actually, Rob was saying that, I was based in Cornwall, and bizarrely, I met his daughter. Bertrand Russell's daughter works in Penzance in Oxfam on the High Street. Very bizarre. Before that, I actually met his grandson, and I just, he looked like Bertrand Russell, but with a ponytail, but I had no idea of the relation. When I found out, I sort of, kneeled before him and said, I'm not worthy because, Russell is philosophical royalty. And I asked him, are you, what sort of philosophy are you interested in then? With this great, he said, well, I just make websites, not really quite disappointing, really. So I thought I'd, become great friends with Russell. No, it didn't happen. Right. Anyway, so Russell, who had a mystical experience himself, not with a pipe, but for another reason. But he wrote, 4 common traits of mystical experiences. And remember, I'm including mystical experience as a type of psychedelic experience, but there's more to it than that. He writes, revelation, belief in the possibility of a way of knowledge which may be called revelation, as contrasted with sense, reason, and analysis, concerning a reality behind the world of appearance. As well as that, he talks about the unreality of division, or in other words, unity, and coming out of that, he talks about the unreality of time, timelessness, or eternality, the eternal. In philosophy, we often distinguish the infinite from the eternal. So the infinite generally means that which never ends, forwards or backwards, in time. And the eternal means outside of time. So it's not infinite duration, it's kind of not just, it's outside of time completely. And interestingly, Russell as well talks about the unreality of good and evil. So the mystic sort of transcends his common moral cultural heritage and sort of sees the world in a sort of in a way beyond good and evil. Again, this is another very fascinating thing to talk about. I won't do it today, but I don't think that's at all focused upon in common discourse yet. Russell writes this in relation to unity now. One of the most convincing aspects of the mystical illumination is the apparent revelation of the oneness of all things, giving rise to pantheism in religion and monism in philosophy. Pantheism means that God is nature. Monism in philosophy, I'll come to that later, but it's basically means that there's not a separation between, first of all, as we see in the first point there, unity of mind and matter. So mind and matter are one thing, but humans see them as two things. It's known as double aspect theory. It's sort of the one thing has two angles to it. This means that all of matter has an element of mind. This is known as panpsychism. This is what I did my thesis on. Philosophers who promote that include Spinoza, Leibniz to some extent, Fechner, William James finally. William James was very critical of panpsychism to start with, but in his final work he came to that position. Unity can also mean unity of subject and not object, also an aspect of monism, so that leads to what Whitehead calls vectorization. So what you perceive is actually part of you. There's no separation between you and the thing. And unity of moments, if all instants of time are one thing, the repercussion is the unreality of time. There's an ancient Greek thing from Parmenides, but we also see it in modern philosophy like McTaggart, a British idealist, Kant, Schopenhauer, and even actually in, think about in physics. So if you think about Minkowski, Einstein, if time is a fourth spatial dimension, then the implication is that we live in a block universe, and the future and the past and the present are all really existent as one object, static object as it were, and we go through time as an illusion. This famous letter from Einstein where he says, we all know, all of us in physics know that time is an illusion, really. But I'll speak about that later. Relating to this more to psychedelic experiences, Alan Watts writes, with regard to unity, the individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, with the universe. To those who have known it, it is as real and overwhelming as falling in love. I got a WhatsApp message this morning, which I have to share with you. It's from a farmer in my village in Cornwall. He used to be a farmer. But he said, good luck with the talk today. And just have to tell you about my 5-MeO DMT experience. I'll just give you, I won't name names as it's being filmed, but he writes this, hi Pete. Good luck with the talk today. Did the 5-MeO again this morning, totally mind-blowing. It most surely is a divine gift from God and the universe, an experience of heaven on earth, something so far from what can be possibly imagined. You have to believe in magic and superpowers. It's like being at the center of the Big Bang, exclamation mark. I feel blessed and honored to have had the ultimate human experience, the ultimate gift possible. We are nothing and we are everything. We are an insignificant drop in the ocean, and yet we are the entire ocean in a single drop. Oh my God, and WTF, whatever that stands for. Over and over again and again, So he sends me this stuff all the time. But I thought that was apt, Maybe he sent it actually because he thought I might read it out. But it's not me. It's actually a proper message. Anyway, so there's unity. One of the most famous philosophers to speak about unity and the mystical experience was Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century AD. He was the first of the so-called Neo-Platonists, the sort of new Platonists. And he wrote this, for how can one describe as other than oneself that which, when one saw it, seemed to be one with oneself? It's very hard to describe in words this unity, and this is one reason William James calls psychedelic experiences or mystical experiences ineffable, like you can't put them in words. Interesting thing Plotinus says after this, I think. This is no doubt why in the mysteries we are forbidden to reveal them to the uninitiated. So I'm sure a lot of you know about the Eleusinian mysteries and other mysteries in Greece, which were sort of annual events in, well, Eleusis was about 15 miles from Athens. People went there and fasted and took a potion, causation, and, famously, like Albert Hoffman said there's probably some kind of drug in that, ergot or whatever. But then, the scholarship of the mysteries say, no, it's nothing to do with drugs at all. It's like a theatre play, some scholars write and so on. But it's quite interesting, I think, how Plotinus talks about this feeling of unity as being an aspect of the mysteries, and one of the reasons why one cannot speak to them. I think that sort of suggests, again, a more psychoactive element in it. Interestingly as well, I should say, the last Neoplatonist, called Proclus, said that in the mysteries, with eyes closed, one sees certain revelations with eyes closed. So again, it sort of suggests that this was not mere theatrics. Anyway, the point here is, unity, the unity of experience, is a very common, shared experience, relatively speaking. Moving away from unity, let's look at the other. So there's also the question about these strange, alien, insectoid kind of creatures one can see on psychedelics. I'm sure a lot of you have met these creatures. The famous one, well, the one that sticks out in my mind is from Rick Strassman's book, The Spirit Molecule, DMT, where he talks about someone being eaten alive by preying sort of giant insectoid beings, but at the same time being made love to. Is that a verb? By these beings, and it being not unpleasant, but not particularly pleasant either. But there are people who believe in the veridicality of the other as well. For example, Andrew Gallimore, who wrote a book about DMT recently. Very good book, which I criticised though, but it was good. Another experience that I had on NN-DMT was seeing a polyhedron spinning eternally for the sake of love. What kind of reality do we bequeath such experiences, can we? And so on. And then the third type of general experience is the self. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too much today, but what kind of revelations can you receive about the self? Well, certainly, at the very basic level, one realizes, and I certainly did, and I'm sure a lot of you did, the power of one's own mind, what one can experience. This is the first shocking thing about psychedelics. So that's, certainly that's a revelation about oneself. You might, of course, gain access to lost memories. This is the basis of certain therapies today with psychedelics. You might gain a new perspective on and change your own personality, in terms of openness and so on. And it's possible that the self may gain knowledge of its fundamental nature on the condition that there is a fundamental nature to the self. This is, a very deep philosophical question. Is the self a verb, or is it a noun? Does it have any kind of substance? There's an interesting few essays recently by Galen Strawson, the philosopher Galen Strawson, on the narrative account of the self. This philosopher finds it very strange that one puts oneself into a narrative. I was born in Harlem and blah blah blah, and then I did this, and then this happened to me, and he thinks it's very strange that one can associate oneself today, with who one was like 5 years ago even. I mean, I do, but perhaps that itself is a hallucination. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about the self today. So those are veridical ways or interpretations of certain psychedelic experiences on one side. So the believers who think that what one experiences are real. On the other side, there's falsidicality. I don't know if that's a proper word, but it sort of goes with veridicality, which sort of means, what you're seeing is false. And there are two main strands of this. Everything here is generalization. In fact, every word is generalization, so you can't avoid generalizations, if you're going to communicate. And there are two strands of falsidicality which are sort of opposed. First of all, there's the theistic one. And I should say that to be a theist, to believe in God, Christian, for example, doesn't mean you believe that psychedelic experiences are false, of course not. But there are strands. So like the famous one is Catholic professor R.C. Zehner, who describes psychedelics, mescaline, who's given mescaline by John Smithies, who I can talk about later. But anyway, he calls it induced mysticism. He says anti-religious. He says farcical meaninglessness. And then he has a moral judgment upon it. He says artificial interference with consciousness is, except for valid medical reasons, wrong. And I think, I don't know, I'd say a lot of people today think, not merely because psychedelics are illegal, but there's a kind of view that they are immoral for some reason. In response to this text by Zehner, another philosopher called H.H. Price wrote a sort of rebuttal of it, saying that, on the contrary, if you're a mind explorer, it's wrong not to take psychedelics. Because, you know, what kind of researcher are you if you don't do the field research? So, you know, again, that's an interesting topic in itself, but I'll leave that to the side as well. So, there are those. I mean, Zehner himself did have a mystical experience, a sort of Catholic one. I think it's in your book, Mike, isn't it, mentioned? So he thought that mystical experiences were possible, but he thought that drugs don't provide them. On the other side of physicality, we find the physicalist. What is physicalism? I'll go into this in a second, but generally, the physical is fundamental. By fundamental is meant that which lies at the bottom, ultimately, of everything. It's fundamental, it's what everything is made of, what everything can be reduced to. The physical is fundamental, and thus all mental phenomena, including that induced by psychedelics, must ultimately be reducible to and explained by physical, physiological, neurological activities. Now, you won't normally get, physicalism works in a sort of subliminal way, in the sense that you won't normally get people, we do some, but usually people don't say they're physicalist. It's just, that's the default position. I certainly was raised that way in England, in my schools in England and Sweden. It's just a sort of ideology which is, you know, that's the norm. You know, it's never made conscious, and so it's therefore never criticized. But ultimately, this is reality, you know, the brain, and we just need to sort of work out how it all works. But ultimately, this is the foundational root. That means that psychedelic experiences cannot be veridical, cannot be revelations, because they are not physical. So we have those two options: veridicality, everything is real; physicality, everything is false in psychedelics. But there's a third option: miracality, part reality, which I've linked to monist metaphysics. Like, some experiences we can rationally say are plausibly veridical, others not. And why can we say that? I mean, what's the basis of that? Well, as I say, monist metaphysics. Metaphysics. Isn't that some kind of like medieval thing that no one really believes in anymore? Or ancient Greek even. The first use of the word metaphysics was by Aristotle in his book, The Metaphysics, which he didn't even call it that. It just, meta means after or beyond, so it's just the book that came after his book, The Physics, you know, so it's literally after physics. But then the interesting thing about that book is it talks about, the subject of that book is about substance, about causality, identity, and so on. And that's what metaphysics really means today. Has taken on other meanings as well, unfortunately, which are completely unrelated to its roots. But that's the general route, in other words, going beyond physics. This join pin group is ruining my slides. I don't know what that is. I'm not going to join it anyway. But metaphysics. Well, what's wrong with physics? Physicalism or physicalism? So I'll just differentiate these things. Physics, then, is simply the science of studying the world, the fundamental elements, forces of nature, and so on. You know what physics means. It's a method. It's not a belief system. It's a science. Some people say, I believe in physics, but of course that doesn't really mean anything, because physicists disagree with each other on very, very fundamental points. There's not really one physics, there's physicses, as it were. I mean, one example being, you know, like one of the fundamental theories of reality is like string theory or M theory, which believes that there are 11 dimensions of space and time. And then there's a competitor which says, no, there are only the 4 dimensions of space and time, and And this is called gravitational field theory. So, there's no such thing as, at the highest level, there's no such thing as like physics or science says or physics says. This is a sort of myth. There's another view called Physicalism, term coined by Galen Strawson, philosopher, and that's the belief that physics can explain everything, including the mind. And Galen Strawson says, no, this is not physical. Physicalism doesn't claim that physics can explain all questions. But Galen Strawson has a very strange definition of physicalism, because he includes panpsychism, the view that mind is in everything, as a form of physicalism, as Karl Popper did as well. Most people don't define it that way. What is physicalism? I'm not going to go through this, but it'll be online again. There's the physics aspect of it, and it changes through time. So a few hundred years ago, it was mechanist, Newtonian. Today, it's the currentist standard model, relativity model, differs from that. It includes nomology, laws, substance, interactions, blah, blah, blah. You'll notice as well, though, that if you say you're a physicalist, there are philosophical elements to that. So therefore, ironically, physicalism is a form of metaphysics in itself, because it includes more than that found in physics. One of the main ones is the no fundamental mentality principle. So that's the belief that, at the fundamental level of matter-energy, there is no mentality. Again, this is really something that physics can't prove in any way, but it's taken as part of the definition of physicalism. And in most cases, I'd say it's taken subconsciously. Now, how does physicalism relate to the hard problem of consciousness, which then relates to the hard problem of psychedelic consciousness? What's wrong with physicalism? Last night I realized there was a typo in physicalism, which really pains me, but hopefully no one will notice that. So the hard problem of consciousness, it's an old problem in philosophy. It was given that name in 1995 by David Chalmers. And it's this, from Chalmers, Australian philosopher's own words. He writes, "The hard problem, why is all this physical processing in the brain accompanied by an experienced inner life? A solution to this problem may profoundly affect our conception of the universe and of ourselves." This really is, a lot of people say, it's not a problem. No, it's a serious problem. It's also called the explanatory gap. It goes back hundreds of years. The philosopher Leibniz had another example of it. It's known as Leibniz's mill. He writes, "One is obliged to admit that perception, or experience, is inexplicable on mechanical principles," so like moving principles, that is, by figures, shapes, and motions. In imagining that there is a machine whose construction would enable it to think, to sense, and to have perception, one could conceive it enlarged while retaining the same proportions, so that one could enter into it, just like into a windmill. Supposing this, one should, when visiting within it, find only parts pushing one another, never anything by which to explain a perception. In other words, if you expanded the brain, sort of zoomed into it, what would you see? You would see, impulses. You'd see molecules, neurotransmitters flowing from synapse to synapse, going, sort of ions going through dendrites and axons and so on. You'd see motions, like in a windmill, a factory, but you'd never see perception, and you'd never be able to explain it, just simply by looking at a windmill. Thomas Nagel, philosopher, has got another interesting example of this thought experiment. Imagine you're in space and you come across this giant entity floating in space. You didn't know whether it was organic or not. How would you be able to tell whether it had sentience? It moved, but machines can move, You couldn't, by looking into the machine, know whether it was sentient or not if it wasn't anything Earth-like, animal-like. Ultimately, this is the question. The mystery of mind as meat, if you're inclined to eat brains, that is, of course. Why is it that a slab of meat, the brain, contains or produces, you have to be careful with the words there, an emotion? How can an emotion turn into an emotion? How can movements become satisfaction, curiosity, logic, memories? This is a profound mystery. Why is it a mystery, really? Okay, let's get into a bit more detail here. And remember, the reason I'm getting into this detail is to say that a certain interpretation of psychedelic experiences being merely physical cannot be a sufficient explanation. So there's different types of physicalisms. So there's eliminativism, which is just deals with it by saying, you know what, consciousness doesn't exist. And believe it or not, this was actually a very common view in the 20th century. And the study of consciousness just wasn't seen to be a scientific study at all, because it didn't really exist. I mean, there are different forms of eliminativism. Behaviorism, logical behaviorism is one of them, which just says, when you say happy, what you really mean is smiling or laughing or jumping or something like this. That's what it is. That's all it is. There's no mysterious mental state that is happiness. But philosophically, this is not really popular anymore. Philosophically, it led to a dead end, the belief that there are no beliefs. It just led to these kind of paradoxes, many more, and there's a lot of literature about it. So it was Chalmers' recoining of this old problem that made a lot of people realize, actually, maybe that consciousness does exist, and that does cause a problem for us. There's another type of physicalism called epiphenomenalism. Again, a big word for a longer sentence. This was coined by Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's grandfather. And it's the view that a mental state, the pink circle, emerges from the brain, but has no efficacy whatsoever, has no power, no potency. It's the analogy Huxley made was with a steam coming off a locomotive engine. It's sort of a byproduct of the brain, and it doesn't do anything. That's not popular generally anymore. Of course, you'll always find people believing one of these, but it's not that popular anymore because of the problem of mental causation, which is shown by the arrow pointing down, the emergentism there. So emergentism, which is popular today, is the view that the brain generates or produces or makes emerge consciousness or sentience, but consciousness or sentience has power. It can affect the brain and the body. And there are reasons, as I'll say in a minute, there's good reasons for believing this to be the case. Free will is a subtype of mental causation. Also popular in the mid-20th century was psychoneural identity theory, which just said, well, the mental basically is the physical. It's the same thing. That was kind of destroyed overnight by a criticism called multiple realization, which I won't get into now. Also, the problem with it is that the properties of the brain, neurons, are very distinct from properties of the mental. Like a neuron has a certain, or a pattern of neurons has a certain width and height, whereas you can't say curiosity has a certain, it's like 3 centimeters long by 2 centimeters by 5 centimeters, it's category error. And so for a number of problems, this is sort of dismissed now as well, generally speaking. Let me go back into mental causation. This is one of the biggest problems for physicalism. Bear with me. I'll take questions, remember. So on the bottom there, brain to brain, one neuron has an impulse and it fires neurotransmitters to the next neuron and so on. Okay, that's explicable through the laws of physics. The problem is the upward arrows. How does the mind emerge from that? What kind of physical law accompanies that? These are not scientific laws. There are correlations, as I shall mention in a minute, but a correlation does not explain the relation. It just says, well, these are correlated. The question is, why are they correlated? And then we have mental causation, T1, moment 1, T2, moment 2. So let's say I think about a beer, and then I have another thought about the fridge. Right? That's a form of mental causation. But again, what kind of force of nature is this? Is it rather that top arrow going right doesn't exist, and it's just one physical state causes that, and the next physical state causes the next thought? That's epiphenomenalism. Possibly, but then you have this problem that there's also, I should say first, another form of mental causation, which is from the mental down to the physical. So my desire for a beer, top left, to the walking of my limbs towards the bar, which is the bottom of T2. Most people believe in this type of mental causation. But again, it's a causal force that is not within physics. But why do we need it? Well, there are logical problems. If mental causation didn't exist, a question posed by F.H. Bradley and Karl Popper and others is why would the mind have evolved if it has no power at all? Not only in humans, but in multiple species. Why does it exist at all? Does not our intelligence have some effect upon human civilization? Do not our perceptions of prey or fruit or whatever have an effect upon our behavior? I mean, to say that they do not, Bradley and Popper say, is an anti-evolutionary theory, because they would not have emerged, let alone maintain themselves, let alone in multiple species. So most people want to maintain mental causation, but at the same time, it just doesn't fit into physical processes. And like I say, neural correlates of consciousness alone. Now, neural correlate of consciousness is this. If I'm happy, for example, and my brain is scanned, perhaps one can gain certain activity in the brain which is correlated to that mental state. And these are known as neural correlates of consciousness. These haven't been fully mapped, and there's still a lot of theories as to how they do correlate. But the belief is that ultimately we'll find correlates, which is quite feasible. In humans, but then that doesn't mean we have correlates in other animals, like octopuses. Octopuses have got 2/3 of their brain in their arms, for example, and completely different brains to humans. But we assume that they are conscious. So the human correlates of consciousness wouldn't explain necessarily the phenomenology of an octopus. Anyway, there is ongoing understanding of correlates of consciousness in humans. But Jae-Gwon Kim, this philosopher here, who actually died 2 weeks ago, sadly, he was one of the greatest of all philosophers of mind, really. He's Korean-American. He wrote this: making a running list of psychoneural correlations does not come anywhere near gaining an explanatory insight into why there are such correlations. This is a very, very important point that I think is missed very, very often, especially when you read every month, and it sort of hurts me really, you get a magazine article come out and it says, something like, for 10,000 years, philosophers have examined the problem of consciousness. But now, scientists have discovered a neuron which explains everything. It doesn't, that's not sufficient. It's always assumed that there are correlates for mental states. That's a given. You don't explain consciousness by simply finding more correlates. I can assume that the correlates all are out there already, they exist. We're working towards that. It still is not an explanation of consciousness. So related to psychedelics then, so when you get a magazine article, say, or a scientific publication saying, we've now mapped the correlates of DMT, phenomenology or something like that, and it's actually just this movement in the brain, as if that explains it. It doesn't at all explain it, You would of course expect correlates in the brain for any experience, be it veridical or not. Neural correlates of consciousness alone neither determine whether an experience is veridical. So, to know that an experience is veridical, I need to know that the object of that phenomenology is real. And looking at the physical alone doesn't tell me that. If I just look at brain scans, I will not know, that will not itself tell me whether the object of that experience exists or not. When for example, if I were to look at this lamp, there would be neural correlates to that in the occipital lobe, visual cortex or whatever it may be. That doesn't mean, of course, looking at that brain doesn't mean that the lamp doesn't therefore exist. One always expects correlates for any experience, be it veridical or not. So it's no good saying that we now know that this is just a brain phenomena and not real by simply looking at the physical correlates. Something similar to this happened about 20 years ago. I don't know, has anyone heard of Persinger's helmet, the God helmet? So about 20 years ago, Persinger created this, and there's a big thing on the news. I remember it sort of as a teenager. He created his helmet, you put it on, and it would just stream in magnetism of some type, or electromagnetism, magnetism actually. And he said, when you put this on, switch it on, you will experience God. And that proves that God's not real. That proves that the mystical experience of God is not veridical. that there can't be a God because you can explain it merely by the movement of the brain. Two problems with that. First of all, it wasn't replicable. I think a Swedish guy, Nyquist, tried to replicate it, didn't work. Even though, interestingly, people like Susan Blackmore, the psychologist, underwent it and said, wow, now I know what it means to know God, or something like this. Could have been, what's it called, a placebo effect. That's the empirical problem with it. The logical problem, again, is this, that even if we found neural correlates of consciousness for God, this is an old theological point, that doesn't mean that God therefore doesn't exist. Again, anything one experiences, one expects neural correlates of. So how does one determine then whether an object of experience doesn't exist? Well, most people will say this. Well, look, I know the lamp is real because I can touch it. Bertrand Russell said the main sense of reality is touch. And with God, I can't touch him, you know, so therefore that surely proves that he's not real. Well, it's not a good reason, because, for example, one can be cognizant of logical entities or mathematical axioms or theorems like the Pythagorean theorem. One can be cognizant of that, but one is not cognizant of it through the senses. Yet it is mind independent, it is objective, it exists as a truth whether one experiences it or not. Just like a lamp exists whether one experiences it or not, but of course not through the traditional senses, you know, sight, vision, sight, sound, and so on. Also, another problem with sensibility is this is the old problem of other minds, one cannot experience directly with the traditional senses other people's consciousness. I can guess your consciousness from your behavior, and by analogy, well, you're a human and you speak in similar ways to me, and therefore I assume, but I can't get into your mind and see the world as you're seeing it and feel the world emotionally as you feel it, you know? So the senses don't provide evidence for the reality of that. One cannot see the past. One infers the past from evidence, but one cannot directly see it, of course. So there are many other reasons as well. Also, of course, not to mention other electromagnetic frequencies, dark matter and so on that we cannot perceive. So senses are very limited. And one can't really determine the veridicality of an object based on senses alone, traditional sense alone. So what other criteria are there? Well, the shared objective experience. If I see the lamp but no one else does in the room, I'll probably question the veridicality of my perception. I'd say, well, okay, what did you put in my drink or something? And of course, the interesting thing is with psychedelic experience, as I said in the beginning, there are shared objects of experience. This unitive state, for example, is, relatively speaking, very common. Another criterion is coherence with other beliefs. You know, if I saw like a cat fly past here with like bat wings, well, that doesn't really cohere with my general belief system. So I think, it's probably not real, and I'd question it again. The problem with that, of course, is that your other beliefs might be false. You know, like the classic example being when the clergy didn't believe that Galileo that in terms of the planetary motions that the sun, the Earth wasn't in the center of the universe. That can't be right because it doesn't cohere with our beliefs. So it's a problematic criterion, but nonetheless it is practical. One generally uses it. Rationality. I mean, if you can give reasons for a belief, for an experience, then there's more, then you have reasons for believing it, of course. Linked to personal past. You know, if you can't link an experience to your life generally, one often thinks it's not real. If one has a dream where your best friend is a crocodile, for example, you can't link that to your past. You know, well, he was a human yesterday working in the office or something, right? So there needs to be that kind of contiguity. Also phenomenal stability and predictability. So, this lectern has been here for the last half hour or whatever, hasn't really moved much, so I assume it, but if it started to wiggle around and sort of float away, and again, I'd question its veridicality. And many more. I mean, this is a massive topic in itself. But the point is here that neural correlates alone are not sufficient to explain, to give reason for saying that an object of experience is not real. So one cannot rule out the veridicality of common shared psychedelic experiences through neural correlation or physicalism, but one can in fact substantiate certain psychedelic states as veridical, as they are shared, stable, linkable to personal, past, and rational, through metaphysics once more. So, I've just given you negative reasons for saying that, well, we can't, dismiss the veridicality of psychedelic experiences based on brain scans alone and physicalism alone, because physicalism essentially is a faith in itself. I mean, it's an ideology. I mean, a lot of physicists are not physicalists. You can do physics and not be a physicalist. This is more of a philosophical doctrine. I mean, if you really look deeply into, like, some of the people who say, like explicitly say, I'm a physicalist, like Smart, for example, the philosopher Smart. He says, the ultimate reason for this, I just cannot believe that the universe is not physical ultimately. I won't accept that, So, and there you have it. And he says this is the confession of faith. In an essay called Materialism in the 1960s. He said this is a confession of faith. Kind of as a joke, but at the same time it's true. It is a confession of faith. It is a belief system. The way belief systems work is they work best when they're never questioned, when they're seen as a default position. Something Zizek talks about. Metaphysics, and why do you need to? So we can't explain psychedelic experience, I'm saying, through brain, neuroscience alone. So we need to go beyond physics, physicalism, to metaphysics. Why? What does it mean? Well, metaphysics then means beyond physics. And in many cases, metaphysics takes the mental to be as, if not more, fundamental than the physical. By fundamental, again, is meant this. So with emergentism, you think the physical is the fundamental stuff of nature, and the brain is physical, and then the mental emerges from that. It's not as fundamental, it's secondary, as it were. Metaphysics often, not always, often takes the mental to be at that primal level, at the same level as the physical, or even at a deeper level in many cases, for example, in idealism. There's a very interesting book by Gerda Wolter. Who's heard of her, just out of interest? Nobody, right? They see. That's why it's even more interesting. Right? And I admit, I only came across her a few weeks ago. But Gerda Wolter was a student of Husserl. Who's heard of Husserl? Okay, good. So Husserl was a famous phenomenologist, really the founder of the modern school of phenomenology. Gerda Wolter was one of his students, and she wrote this great book. I really recommend it, called The Phenomenology of Mysticism. And in that book, she writes this. It's not fully translated into English, but you can get the first 2 chapters in English. I can email that to you if you're interested. Just email me, peter@philosopher.eu. She writes this: the mystical is an irreducible, primordial phenomenon, a basic primordial givenness that cannot be traced back to or derived from some other phenomena, such as colors, sounds, values, and so on, 1923. So that's, although she's in phenomenology here, not metaphysics, this is the general idea of metaphysics, asking what is fundamental. How do we explain the mental? Do we have to use the physical to explain the mental, or vice versa? Or is there an even deeper level? Now, I believe, this is getting personal now, that one of the best ways to understand the mystical subcategory of psychedelic experiences and the subcategory of unity therein, which is shared common experience, and ticks the boxes of that veridicality, is through the philosophy of Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza, his main book is called The Ethics. It's not about ethics, really, at all. It's about metaphysics. But he was very influential, but very controversial. I mean, he was excommunicated by the Jewish community from where he came. It was the sort of Spanish Portuguese Jews who moved up into Amsterdam to flee persecuting Catholics. But anyway, in Amsterdam, he was excommunicated for his views, and then sort of became a Christian briefly, and they excommunicated him as well. And he didn't publish his main book until he didn't publish his own book. It was posthumous. But anyway, in that book, and I should say this, being a Spinozist, I've read a biography of Kant, the philosopher Kant, who died in 1804, I believe. Or was it 1824? It could be 1824. No, 1804. He said, I remember the writer saying, if you said you were a Spinozist in those days in that area in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, you would be executed. You'd lose your job, you'd lose your rent. It's a bit like saying you're a fascist today. It's like absolutely forbidden in many cases in this area, at least. There's a Protestant area there. But anyway, Spinoza, his philosophy. I should say this: Einstein was a huge fan of Spinoza, so it's not, anti-scientific. Einstein wrote, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists." A lot of people say, Einstein, was he religious or not? I mean, it really comes down to the Spinozism he had. Spinoza is the greatest of modern philosophers because he's the first philosopher who deals with the soul and the body as one, not as two separate things. In other words, a monism, panpsychism, ultimately. As I'm on Einstein, there's another interesting line from him. He writes, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. We should know that what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms." So Einstein himself was, very amenable to this kind of monist philosophy. Einstein was invited, by the way, to something I keep talking about called Outside, a project that Smithies, Osmond, and Huxley had, a planned project where they'd get like 100 leading intellectuals, including Jung and Einstein, to take mescaline and write about it in the 50s. And unfortunately, it never happened, And then, but that would have swayed the psychedelic discourse, quite radically, I believe. But anyway, that's just argument by authority there. So what is Spinozism? Well, it's generally this. It's God, which he also calls nature, and that's why he's controversial, or substance, is the universe, is everything. And there are different attributes of this nature, God, substance, universe, and the two of which we humans have access to are extension, which basically means matter, or the physical, and thought, which in this case means the mental, sentience. But there are an infinite number of other attributes as well, Spinoza writes, and there are modes of that, so a particular thought or a particular piece of matter. Interestingly, the unitive experience that many people have under psychedelics coheres with this very nicely, and this is a very rational philosophy, I should say. It was never refuted. Metaphysics was never refuted. It just sort of goes out of fashion, comes into fashion. It was not like a scientific theory like heat being a fluid that was cast away as disproved. It was never disproved. It's just, like I say, fluctuated away in terms of fashion. Spinoza has a really interesting type of experience that is rare, but he writes about it. He calls it the amor de intellectualis, or the intellectual love of God. He writes, "The intellectual love of the mind towards God, nature, is the very love with which he loves himself, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he can be manifested through the essence of the human mind, considered under the form of eternity, timelessness. This love or blessedness is called glory in the sacred writings." You know the term cosmic consciousness, which was big in the 60s, Alan Watts wrote a book about it. It comes from, one of the originators of it was a psychiatrist called R.M. Buck, and he wrote the book, Cosmic Consciousness. And, not Watts, Buck. And in it, he gives us an example of cosmic consciousness. I think this is a book written in 1901, about the same time as James's Varieties of Religious Experience. He writes about this intellectual love of God as one of the prime examples of cosmic consciousness. So sort of before the whole psychedelic thing began, and the term that was adopted included this kind of metaphysics, which was never really later dwelled upon, partly because it takes a lot of effort to get into Spinoza. But Spinoza said there was a form of intuition where one could perceive the whole of nature, or God, or reality, all at once in its timeless, eternal manifestation. Very much like this unitive experience. But in Spinoza's metaphysics, it all makes sense. It gives reasons for everything in a very detailed manner. Another philosopher who I think provides an interesting metaphysics for interpreting psychedelics is Leibniz and his monadology. Alfred North Whitehead said Leibniz explained what it is like to be an atom. So he was a panpsychist. An atom itself had a very basic, primitive form of consciousness, more akin to our subconsciousness, but nonetheless, every aspect of matter was sentient as well. And This coheres with many psychedelic experiences, certainly that I've had and read about, where one perceives a sort of embedded intrinsic value within all things, a sentience within all things. Charles Hartshorne wrote this. Charles Hartshorne was a kind of a Whiteheadian philosopher in America. He wrote, "What Leibniz thus discovered is the immensely important fact by which all materialism, physicalism, is rendered suspect. That is not the function or within the capacity of external perception to tell us what things are. In other words, our senses only give us the shell of reality, you know. I'm not just talking about like this lectern, well, the shell, but if I look on the other side, I'll get the full reality, or if I dig into the wood, I'd get more. No, all perception just gives you the outer shell, even with humans. You know, like I said, I can open up Rob's skull, for example, and look into his brain and cut that open and have a look in there, and I still won't find anyone at home at all. And that's not Rob, it's not a personal thing, it's simply the fact that, perception doesn't deliver, like I said, all objective realities. Leibniz pointed this out with his mill and so on, and his general metaphysics makes sense of a lot of these unusual mystical states. Of course, I'm not saying that that therefore doesn't mean that all psychedelic experiences are veridical. Of course not. I'm talking about the unitive state that has a shared experience that is rational, can be linked to one's past, and coheres rationally with a systematic metaphysics. I mean, there's obviously hallucinations, one of the greatest of which is this one from Oliver Sacks. He writes, under Artane, he writes, a spider called out, hello. I said, hello yourself. And with this we started a conversation, mostly on rather technical matters of analytic philosophy. Perhaps this direction was suggested by the spider's opening comment. Did I think Bertrand Russell had exploded Frege's paradox? A veridical entity, you know. I think you'd be hard-pressed, you know, there'd be exceptions, but you'd be hard-pressed for anyone to say that was a veridical experience in any way. So obviously, hallucinations do exist. They can be induced by drugs, amongst other things. So one shouldn't accept everything, but where there is a good reason to believe in the objective existence of certain experiences, one there has more plausibility to believe in them. Bertrand Russell, as he was mentioned by the spider, wrote this in regard to metaphysics. Metaphysics has been developed from the first by the union and conflict of two very different human impulses, one urging men towards mysticism, the other urging them towards science. So in a way, this sums up the interpretive trichotomy that I spoke about, which is belief in everything, this is extreme of course, belief in none of the objective experience of psychedelics, which is kind of, I would say, the standard medical framework today. But then there's this third option, metaphysics, you know, which sees psychedelic experiences in a more charitable light, certainly some of them, and can explain them as not mere hallucination. Well, anyway, so like I said, this is has been mostly a negative thing. So, just to say what I've been talking about. I've rejected the two extreme streams for determining veridicality, the mantis veridicalists, as you can call them, and theist physicalists. I didn't go into theism. I'm not a Christian, and although I've got a lot of sympathy for certain Christians, but there's a certain strand which I would reject. Physicalism I think the hard problem of consciousness is not a hard problem. I think it's an impossible problem. There's just no way. It's just not within the framework of physicalism, which is generally the framework of modern science, but it's not exactly the same. It's just not possible to explain mentality this way. It's not a hard problem, it's just you have to broaden the criteria for truth. So physicalism, therefore, is refuted. So you can't use physicalism to explain consciousness. I mean, let's say that you fully found the neural correlates of consciousness. That wouldn't explain consciousness. That would just give you the correlates. That's it. You still need to explain the relation. They're insufficient to explain consciousness, let alone psychedelic consciousness. So therefore, I argue that one should reject any such reduction in popular magazines and popular or scientific journals. Nor can neural correlates of consciousness alone determine veridicality of all experience. You know, this is something that's assumed very often. Can't. We need to look for further criteria for determining veridicality. It's a negative side. I think that's pretty solid. I'll take questions about it, but I will argue the case. The positive side, which is more speculative, is that, okay, so we can't use that to explain psychedelics. The positive side is perhaps we can use something else, not physics, but metaphysics, to explain psychedelic experiences. There are certain metaphysicians like Spinoza, Leibniz, Whitehead. I didn't talk about Whitehead today because I overdo it. I speak about him too much, getting bored of him now. But those kind of speculative metaphysicians who give a lot of fortify the veridicality of psychedelic experiences. So ultimately, I think there's a need for a thorough metaphysical psychedelic phenomenological system. I think this is the ultimate goal, perhaps, of my life. Before I finish, I just want to say I'm organising a conference next to university in April 2020, which you're welcome to attend. There will be 50 tickets for sale on philosophical aspects of psychedelics, the first ever conference on the philosophy of psychedelics. So I hope you come to that. I was really supposed to be here to sell my new book, but I haven't finished it yet because there's one final chapter on n-dimensional space, which I just can never finish because it's like one of these fractals. You go into one part and it opens up and you think, oh God, I have to study this now for a few months and then blah, blah, blah. But it will come out soon, so look out for that as a collection of essays. My PhD hasn't been published yet, but the appendix will come out as a hip-hop track very soon, apparently. So there you go. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Just out of interest, how annoyed do you get? And do you think it's the neuroscientists or the journalists thinking that the problem consciousness is the effect?
That's a very interesting question, So I know a lot of neuroscientists say, I didn't say this. This was a bloody journalist who misinterpreted the evidence. Good question. I think it's mostly journalists, but not all journalists. But I'd say some neuroscientists are also guilty of this. I mean, one interesting thing about neuroscience is that there's a massive confusion in the system between for understanding what a necessary and a sufficient condition means. The term is very often used in neuroscience without any understanding what it means. It's a very important thing. So it's a bit of both. But I've got I should say this as well. I've got complete full respect for neuroscientists, and what they're doing is incredibly valuable, especially in terms of medicine and therapy. But there are limitations of it. It's a bit like anesthetics. They're very useful, and we know they turn off consciousness, but no one actually knows why. But it doesn't matter, because you can still use anesthetics to help people without really understanding the full explanatory reason. If we knew how anesthetics works, of course we would be able to understand the full neurocorrelates of consciousness, or at least what turns consciousness on. But that's understood. But again, like I say, it doesn't matter. But like quantum physics as well. Like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is shut up and calculate, right? So we don't need to understand why it's so weird. It's just like, well, we can use it in computers and make weapons or whatever. That's sufficient. But it's just, my point is just understanding that limitation, and therefore understanding what's open, what's still possible to know.
So I think we're going to take a break now because we're out of time. So if you have any more questions, please, we'd be really, really happy to talk to you. So please do grab them.